Senator Kane.
Welcome to episode 32 of the Horror Double Bill, the podcast where each week we pair two movies to create something far greater than the sum of their parts. I'm Craig Johnson, and as this is our first episode back after the holiday break, I hope that everyone had a very good holiday season and a happy new year. Before we go any further into this week's episode, it's really quite clear that the world is a very scary place at the moment, certainly far scarier than any of the movies that we will be discussing over the coming months. So I'm hoping that here, at least, I can offer some small escape from the real horrors of the outside world. That being said, this week we are opening our second season with two movies about ancient gods and a possible apocalypse. So do with that what you will. First up, we have one of the foundational movies of the folk horror genre, Blood on Satan's Claw from 1971. This was directed by Piers Haggard and stars Linda Hayden, Michele Dotrice, Simon Williams, Wendy Padbury and Patrick Wymark. Then we jump forward to 1994 with In the Mouth of Madness, John Carpenter's tribute to cosmic horror, starring Sam Neill, Julie Carmen, Jürgen Prochnow and David Warner. Along the way, we'll be discussing the literary roots of both folk and cosmic horror, the writers Arthur Machen and Algernon Blackwood, the career of actress Linda Hayden, the horror movies of actor Sam Neill, and much, much more. Before we do any of that though, as always, I'd just like to mention the main sources that I've used for this week's episode, all of which will be, as usual, listed and linked in the show notes. So, when discussing Blood on Satan's Claw, I have referenced the book Blood on Satan's Claw, written by David Evans Powell, which is published by Liverpool University Press in their series titled Devil's Advocates. I've also referenced the book English Gothic, Classic Horror Cinema, 1897 to 2015 by Jonathan Rigby, an interview with Linda Hayden titled An Angel for Satan that can be found on YouTube, the website of writer Robert Wynne Simmons, robertwynsimmons.com, and interviews and commentaries with the cast, crew and director that can be found on the special edition Blu-ray release from 88 Films. And when discussing In the Mouth of Madness, I have referenced the book In the Mouth of Madness by Michael Blythe, which again is part of the Devil's Advocate series from Liverpool University Press, and interviews, commentaries and special features that can be found on the special edition Blu-ray release from Arrow Films. I've also referred to the Wikipedia and IMDb pages for both movies, and an excellent and extremely well-researched YouTube channel called the Eldritch Archives, which I will again link in the show notes. The term folk horror is a slightly amorphous one, having entered the public consciousness in 2010, when it was used by presenter and writer Mark Gatiss in his BBC TV series A History of Horror. He used this term to describe three movies that have since gone on to be categorised as the quote-unquote unholy trinity of British folk horror movies. These are Witchfinder General from 1968, which we covered back in episode 22, The Wicker Man from 1973, and our first movie of the week, Blood on Satan's Claw from 1971. In the documentary, Gatiss stated that all three could be loosely grouped, at least under the folk horror umbrella, since they all share a common obsession with the British landscape, its folklore, and its superstitions. Since this time, the term has become far more commonplace in discussions about horror. Documentaries have been made about the subgenre. Multiple films have deliberately echoed the themes and aesthetics of these earlier movies, and the term has been used to retrospectively categorize any number of films that have folklorish themes or countryside settings. And while some of these categorizations I completely agree with, others I am really not so sure about, and being brutally honest, I'm convinced it's only a matter of time before programs like Gardener's World start being pushed into the folk horror category. Part of the challenge lies in the rather loose definition of what I suppose is a relatively recent categorization. It's far easier to define a giallo movie, a slasher, or a ghost story than it is a folk horror film. And with movies like the Texas Chainsaw Massacre being argued for inclusion on social media, I suspect that the term will become even more vague and loose as time goes on, as opposed to becoming more defined and precise. That being said, though, many definitions do seem to focus on a cluster of tropes, which include the landscape itself as an antagonist, ancient customs and belief systems as threats to modernity and rational thinking, and the notion that the past isn't so much buried as lying in wait to be resurrected. But the Gothic documentary was not the first time that the term was applied to the horror genre. In 2007, Jonathan Rigby, who acted as a consultant and also made an appearance in the documentary, used the term in his book American Gothic to describe a lost 1923 film called Puritan Passions. This was the story about a scarecrow brought to life through magic and starred the actor Osgood Perkins, the father of Psycho star Antony, and after whom his own son, the present-day director Osgood Perkins, would be named. Even before Rigby's use of the term, though, it was used in a 2004 Fangoria interview with director Piers Haggard, when he described our first film of the week as his own attempt to quote-unquote make a folk horror film. And indeed, we could argue that Blood on Satan's Claw was one of the earliest conscious attempts to make a folk horror film, with the original Victorian setting of the screenplay changed to the 17th century, following the success of Tygon Studios' earlier film, Witchfinder General. But the origins of the term go back even further still, with some writers arguing that its first use in print was either in a 1936 English Teacher's Journal or a 1946 publication Our Time, when it was applied to a Robert Louis Stevenson story from 1881, titled Thrawn Janet. This story, written by Stevenson in his native Scots, tells the tale of a preacher arriving in a small town who makes the mistake of hiring the eponymous Janet as his housekeeper, a woman who, as it turns out, may be in league with the devil. This was described in the magazine Our Time as a quote-unquote tour de force of folk horror, and certainly gives us a few of the tropes that we would now recognise as central to the subgenre: an outsider arriving in a small town, superstitious country folk, witch hunting, as we of course see in Witchfinder General, and of course the art of witchcraft itself. This narrative of a supposedly decent and isolated town hiding rather dark secrets is one that would be repeated time and time again across both literature and cinema, and is one of the key principles of the folk horror movement, with Satanism often exchanged for pagan rites or other supposed pre-Christian belief systems. Perhaps one of the greatest literary exponents of folk horror, though, was the Welsh writer Arthur Machen, whose work would not only sow some of the seeds of the movement, but would also act as a significant influence on the creation of cosmic horror, a subgenre which can be used to describe our second film of the week, John Carpenter's In the Mouth of Madness. In 1894, Machen published his novella, The Great God Pan, a highly controversial work which caused a huge scandal on its original release and had a significantly detrimental impact on Machen's reputation as both a man and as an author. Described by critics of the time as, quote, too morbid to be the production of a healthy mind, end quote, and a perfectly abominable story that was a dangerous threat to the entire British public, the novella has since gone on to be recognised as one of the bedrocks of modern horror literature. It certainly influenced subsequent works by H.P. Lovecraft, Dracula author Bram Stoker, and Stephen King, to name just a few. Its influence, then, on the worlds of both folk and cosmic horror cannot be overstated, though sadly it is not necessarily a story that many modern readers will have encountered. Set in 19th century Wales, The Great God Pan tells the story of an experiment that goes horribly wrong, opening a gateway to ancient evils that are then visited on subsequent generations. The intent of the experiment is to open the mind of a young woman named Mary so that she can experience the spiritual world, something that the doctor conducting the experiment describes as seeing the great god Pan. As I mentioned, this experiment goes rather drastically wrong, and young Mary is left as quote-unquote a hopeless idiot. But many years later, a mysterious young woman named Helen Vaughan arrives in a small rural community and proceeds to befriend the local children, taking them on long walks in the woods, where they encounter a mysterious entity. And this is something that we can see echoed in the movie Blood on Satan's Claw. If you've never read the story, I highly recommend it, and there is an excellent audiobook of the novella produced by Horror Babble that can be found on YouTube, and which I will link in the show notes. Following The Great God Pan, Machen published many other stories that could be classified as either folk or cosmic horror, or indeed a hybrid of the two, featuring pre-human entities lurking in the Welsh hills, witchcraft, ancient rites and paganism, amongst other themes. These include the Novel of the Black Seal, published in 1895, The White People, published in 1904, and The Hill of Dreams, published in 1907, to name just a few. At the same time, the writer Algernon Blackwood was also ploughing the furrows of both folk and cosmic horror, perhaps most notably with the 1907 publication of his story The Willows, and the 1910 publication of the story The Wendigo. The latter tells the story of a group of hunters who, on a trip into the Canadian wilderness, encounter the Native American legend of the Wendigo, while The Willows describes a canoe trip along the River Danube, where the landscape itself becomes a threat and unseen entities lurk in the titular willows, which may act as a portal to another dimension altogether. While the idea of alternative dimensions is of course firmly in the world of the cosmic, the concept of nature itself as malevolent is something that would feed into folk horror, and also foreshadows the menacing countryside that we see in many subsequent entries in the subgenre. An audio version of The Willows has also been produced by Horror Babble, and again, I will link to the YouTube version in the show notes. Nature, read in Tooth and Claw, also emerges in several of the stories of Edwardian writer Hector Hugh Munro, who published under the pen name Saki. His story, Sredni Vashtar, published in 1911, tells of a lonely and persecuted little boy who builds a folk religion around his pet polecat ferret, while The Music on the Hill, published in the same year, tells the story of a politician's wife who moves to the countryside and discovers that the worship of Pan has not quite died out. I first encountered the story when it was told by the actor Jonathan Pryce in the 1980 BBC series Spine Chillers. This has been uploaded to YouTube, and I will also link that in the show notes as well. Other writers that we can see as feeding into the genre include M.R. James, who we discussed back in episode 28, with characters encountering ancient and malevolent forces in the rural landscapes of England. These tales blended his antiquarian expertise with folklore and local legends. A Whistle and I'll Come to You and A Warning to the Curious are both prime examples of this, so much so that he is often called one of the fathers of folk horror. But it would not just be fiction that would influence both the folk and cosmic horror genres, though I'm sure that some would argue the next works I'm about to discuss might sit more comfortably in that category than they do in anthropology. In 1890, Scottish anthropologist Sir James George Fraser began publishing his work The Golden Bough, a study in comparative religion, which would be retitled The Golden Bough, a study in magic and religion, for its second edition. By the author's own admission, this was a highly speculative work, which tried to define shared elements of magical systems, world religion, and scientific thought. Fraser suggested that many ancient religions were essentially fertility cults, revolving around the worship and the periodic sacrifice of a sacred king, in line with the changing of the seasons. And as such, the work covered fertility rites and sacrifice as two of the key elements. This is an idea that we would go on to see in many folk horror classics, including, of course, The Wicker Man, as well as the 1978 US TV movie The Dark Secret of Harvest Home, which was based on a novel by Thomas Tryon. We also see it in the Shirley Jackson story The Lottery, and more recent films like Midsommar from 2019, 2023's The Lord of Misrule, and, if we're honest, probably far too many others to mention. Whilst I do not know enough about the Golden Bough to dismiss it completely out of hand, and I certainly don't want a load of neo-pagans coming after me, it has been highly criticised, and the author himself said of his work, quote, "Books like mine, merely speculation, will be superseded sooner or later, the sooner the better for the sake of truth, by better induction based on fuller knowledge." End quote. Other critics, though, were far more harsh, calling Fraser an embarrassment and his work a potpourri of evidence pulled from here, there, and everywhere. Worse still, he was also accused of, at best, confirmation bias, and at worst, doctoring his evidence to fit his predetermined theories. Nevertheless, the impact of his work on literature and on the folk and cosmic horror genres cannot be overstated. As well as the films mentioned previously, The Golden Bough is mentioned in H.P. Lovecraft's The Call of Cthulhu, and also served as an inspiration for writers as varied as T.S. Eliot, W.B. Yeats, James Joyce, Ernest Hemingway, and D.H. Lawrence. That being said, though, Fraser's work can be seen as almost infallible when compared with what came next. In 1921, the anthropologist Margaret Murray published her hypothesis, titled The Witch Cult in Western Europe, a work which is also mentioned in Lovecraft's The Call of Cthulhu, and which, by all accounts, gave him the inspiration for the Cthulhu cult that one of the narrators encounters in the woodlands of New Orleans. In her work, Murray states that the witch trials, which took place between the 15th and 18th century, were, in fact, an attempt to suppress an ancient religion that predated Christianity, and that this religion revolved around the worship of a horned god of fertility and also of the underworld. Very quickly dismissed by historians on its publication, the criticisms did not stop her theories finding root in popular culture, and Murray herself was invited to write the entry on witchcraft for the Encyclopaedia Britannica, in which she presented her theories as historical fact. This entry would go on to be reprinted right up until the late 1960s, so it's perhaps no surprise that we can see the influence of her work not only in the stories of H.P. Lovecraft, but also within folk horror, particularly Blood on Satan's Claw, proving that a good story often travels much further than the truth. All of which brings us to our first film of the week, which is, of course, Blood on Satan's Claw from 1971. This was written by Robert Wynne Simmons, directed by Piers Haggard, and stars Linda Hayden, Michele Dotrice, Simon Williams, Wendy Padbury, and Patrick Wymark. And now we are getting into the spoilers, So, as always, if you have yet to watch Blood on Satan's Claw, please tread very lightly moving forward. As I mentioned at the top of the show, this film is often listed as one of the unholy trinity of the folk horror movement, and we can reasonably argue that it was the first film to consciously and deliberately work within the folk horror subgenre. It was written by Robert Wynne Simmons and was his first full-length feature film screenplay, having only recently graduated with a master's degree in English literature from Cambridge University. Simmons had been interested in film from a very early age and had been making 8mm movies from the age of just 12 years old, as well as writing stories and plays inspired by a rather unhappy childhood. The victim of extensive psychological and physical bullying from other children, distress and anxiety manifested itself in a string of intestinal conditions to which he nearly lost his life at the age of just 19. And with this in mind, it's hardly surprising that in this screenplay he depicts children, and not adults, as the emissaries of evil. Shortly after graduating, Simmons began to submit unsolicited letters to several film companies, and on New Year's Day 1970, he received a reply from the British film company Chiltern Films. On his website, robertwynsimmons.com, he says, quote, "The letter was from a young film company called Chiltern Films, who had made a very good deal with Pinewood Studios to shoot a horror film starting on April the 1st. They had 30 scripts submitted from various agents, but were not really happy with any of them, so they told me I was welcome to send them an idea, if I had one. I immediately rang them up and told them I had an idea which I hoped would fit the bill. This was a complete lie, but I did not want to let the opportunity pass by. They said fine, but they were in a hurry. Could I get something to them by next Tuesday then? 5 days away. I said I could." End quote. What made this task even more challenging was that the studio was not just looking for one story. The then trend for anthology movies, ushered in by the success of Amicus Studios, meant that Chiltern were looking to make their own omnibus film, and so wanted 3 short stories as opposed to just one. The logic behind this was that 3 short films could potentially be made more cheaply and with a smaller crew, and that indeed they could also perhaps be sold as individual episodes for television. Reverting to the stories that he had written in childhood, which he had collected under the title Legends of Torment of Body and Soul, Simmons came up with 3 separate tales called The Hand, The Claw, and The Devil's Skin. These stories concerned, respectively, a man who is attacked by his own possessed hand and hacks it off, which anticipates Sam Raimi's The Evil Dead by more than a decade, a young woman who is driven insane when locked in her attic by an aunt, and a group of teenagers who find something rather nasty when out playing in a field. But Simmons was not particularly a fan of the anthology movie, and so wanted to find a way that he could link the 3 stories together. He did this by featuring overlapping characters, as opposed to the very distinct and separate episodes that he would have seen in films like Dr. Terror's House of Horrors or Torture Garden. Ultimately, Chiltern and co-producers Tygon British saw his point of view and decided to make a full-length feature after all. He then set about turning the 3 linked episodes into a more cohesive overall narrative. And here we reach perhaps one of the biggest criticisms of the movie, which is that despite Simmons' best efforts, the story does feel rather episodic, with characters disappearing from the action for long periods of time, or worse still, vanishing altogether with little to no explanation. Retrospective reviews have frequently highlighted that the structure is too fragmented and that the film suffers from a lack of overall focus. But I have to say that personally I don't find it to be so, and I think that Simmons did a rather good job of papering over the joins. This is helped in great part by the direction from Piers Haggard, the cinematography from director of photography Dick Bush, and the highly evocative score from composer Mark Wilkinson. That being said, though, both Simmons and director Piers Haggard agree with the critique, and both of them have noted the difficulties in redrafting the script into a single narrative, particularly given the time constraints and the looming deadline of an April shoot. In later interviews, Haggard went on to say that, quote, "Ideally, you'd have taken it away for 3 months and thought it through and structured it much better." End quote. And indeed, Simmons would take up this opportunity many years later, adapting the screenplay into a more cohesive novel that was published in 2023. This was also adapted into an Audible original drama featuring the omnipresent Mark Gatiss and his League of Gentlemen co-star Reece Shearsmith, along with familiar horror faces Ralph Ineson and Alice Lowe. Being completely transparent, I have neither read the novel nor listened to the audio drama, but they are both on my ever-growing to be read, or should that be to be listened to, list. Simmons' original screenplay had set the story in Victorian England, but Tygon British Productions and original producer Christopher Neill felt that the Victorian Gothic had very much run its course, and given the downward spiral of Hammer films at the time, it's fair to say that he probably had a point. In addition, as I mentioned earlier, Tygon had enjoyed considerable success with their movie Witchfinder General, and were keen to emulate the style and period of that earlier film. At their request, the setting was moved to the 17th century, and given the retrospective status as one of the cornerstones of folk horror, I would suggest that they had a point here as well. They also insisted on the inclusion of a few scenes that would deliberately echo the earlier Michael Reeves film, most notably the scene where Margaret, played by Michele Dotrice, is ducked in the pond as a witch, and the Book of Witches that is used as a resource, first by the Doctor, played by Howard Gorney, and then by the Judge, played by Patrick Wymark. They also wanted to change the title. Simmons' original screenplay had been called The Devil's Touch, and then The Devil's Skin, but Tygon wanted something a little more eye-catching. At one point, the title The Ghouls Are Among Us was suggested by the head of the studio, Tony Tenser, though, happily enough, this was rejected. In fact, it was only when the movie was purchased for distribution by American International Pictures, or AIP, that it was given the title Blood on Satan's Claw, with the reasoning that it would be lurid enough to draw in a wide audience. By the time of this decision, the film had been released in the UK for just under a week with the title The Devil's Touch, and so it was hastily retitled with the name under which it was now known. Haggard himself was less than happy with the new title, and also with the equally lurid marketing campaign, as he felt it distracted from the serious story that he was trying to tell. I can certainly see his point, but at least the title does convey the animalistic and violent nature of the film, which it most certainly has. It was, however, still released in some regions under the title Satan's Skin, and rather confusingly, some recent DVD releases have been released with the title Blood on Satan's Claw on the cover, but still with the Satan's Skin title card on the actual film itself. And as to whether there is a "the" at the beginning of the title, the answer is it depends very much on what source you are using, and also what Blu-ray or DVD release you happen to have. So, if you've heard me switching from one to the other over the course of this episode, please don't come at me in the comments. It is, if I'm honest, all rather confusing. The final screenplay and the finished film tells the story of a rural village in 17th century England, which is besieged by evil when a farmer unearths a monstrous skull while out ploughing his fields. This skull is the remnant of an ancient demon, or perhaps even an ancient god, the Behemoth, who rises from the fields and the furrows and infects the local community with his malignance as his body becomes corporeal. This is an idea that would be resurrected, if you'll forgive the pun, by Clive Barker in his 1984 story Rawhead Rex, which would be published in his groundbreaking collection, The Books of Blood, and would itself be turned into a rather terrible film of the same title in 1986. But unlike that story, where the monster emerges fully formed, here the beast is resurrected in fragments, leading to what is perhaps the film's weirdest central conceit. In order for the beast to be fully reformed, patches of his skin and body start to emerge on the local children, a claw hand here, a hairy back there, body parts that must be harvested through mutilation and murder. Leading the carnage is his acolyte, a young girl rather ironically named Angel Blake, who gradually gathers a group of disciples around her in worship of the beast and commits murder and many other atrocities in his name. It is up to the remaining good people of the village, led by the rather morally dubious judge, to put an end to the nightmare. But this is something that can only be achieved when the beast is all but fully reformed. As the judge says, quote, "I will return when the time is right, but you must have patience, even when people die. Only thus can the whole evil be destroyed. You must let it grow." End quote. This narrative gives rise to two central themes of the film. The first of evil being a form of infection, spreading at first through the children before it reaches outwards to the wider community. And this is something that we will also see in our second film of the week, In the Mouth of Madness. The second theme is that of the perversion of innocence, with Angel Blake leading the local teenagers astray into an orgy of sex and violence, placing the film not just in the category of folk horror, but also linking it directly to the period in which it was made. I am referring here to the death of the love generation, which we discussed back in episode 17 when we covered 1971's Let's Scare Jessica to Death. By the end of the 1960s, the world was still reeling from the Tate LaBianca murders that were committed by the Manson family, and more than one commentator has mentioned the parallels between Angel Blake's minions and the Manson cult. This is something that Jonathan Rigby describes in his book English Gothic, saying, quote, "The youthful idealism of the 1960s alternative society had come to a grotesque end with the Manson murders of August 1969, and by recasting hairy Svengali, Charles Manson, as 17th century sex kitten Angel Blake, the film provided a blueprint for much 1970s horror, which would concentrate almost obsessively on the lethal potential of teenagers, children, and even babies." End quote. More than this, though, and possibly not so widely remembered now, the film also echoed the murders committed by Mary Bell in Newcastle, England in 1968. Britain's youngest female killer, Bell was only 10 years old when she murdered her first victim, and 11 when she murdered her second, crimes which left the UK reeling and which would still have been very much in the public consciousness when the film was released in 1971. Linda Hayden, who plays Angel, noted these similarities herself in an interview given many years later, calling Blake a Mary Bell equivalent, and noting that comparisons were made when the film opened to the public. While the screenplay was still in development, Tygon British sought a director and offered the film to Piers Haggard, the great-great-nephew of the writer H. Rider Haggard, who wrote the stories King Solomon's Mines and She, which had been filmed by Hammer Studios in 1965, starring Ursula Andress and Christopher Lee. Piers Haggard OBE, to give him his correct title, was born in London in 1939, but was raised on a farm in Scotland, and this rural background spent working on farms would turn out to lend itself incredibly well to this story of the English countryside. His direction places much emphasis on the landscape and contrasts the beauty of the land with the nightmarish acts committed by the children. Moving away from the farm, he studied English at Edinburgh University, where he was active in the Dramatic Society as both an actor and director, and he also helped establish the Festival Fringe Society in 1958, an organisation responsible for the careers of any number of British comedians and actors. He then began his career as an assistant director at the Royal Court Theatre in 1960, before moving on to the Glasgow Citizens Theatre in 1962 and then the National Theatre Company in 1963, where he worked with Laurence Olivier and Franco Zeffirelli. In 1965, he moved from theatre into television, directing plays for the BBC series 30-Minute Theatre, as well as episodes of the series Play for Today, Armchair Theatre, and Man at the Top for ITV. In 1966, he moved into feature films, working as a dialogue assistant on the Michelangelo Antonioni film Blow Up, which starred David Hemmings and Vanessa Redgrave. This is now seen as one of the defining films of 1960s Britain, and if you've never seen it, it is one that I would highly recommend. If nothing else, its storyline of a photographer who may or may not have witnessed a murder foreshadows the Italian giallo films of Dario Argento by a good 4 years. In 1970, he made his directorial debut with a film called I Can't, which is where the producers of Blood on Satan's Claw first encountered him. Impressed with his work, they offered him the opportunity to direct the movie, and although he was not exactly what one would call a typical horror director, he was a great admirer of James Whale's Frankenstein from 1931 and The Bride of Frankenstein from 1935. He was particularly enamoured with the director's ability to make the horrifying poetic and to find beauty in the monstrous, and this is something that he would certainly apply to his first horror picture. In an interview with Shock magazine in 1996, he explained, quote, "I was quite arty-farty really, but I remember realising at some point that horror films are great. In horror, you can deal with the big issues if you want to. Life, death, resurrection, terror, nightmare, as long as you entertain. You can't deal with these issues in most commercial cinema. People just don't want to see it." End quote. What excited him most about the film, though, was that it was set in the countryside, giving him the opportunity to make it as poetic as he could, drawing, of course, on his own childhood experiences. Haggard came on board when the film was still in its anthology format, and it was he, along with Simmons, who convinced Tygon British that a full-length feature would be far more effective. His earlier experience as a dialogue coach here also paid dividends, and he worked very closely with Simmons to make the 17th century discourse as authentic as they possibly could. As I mentioned, Haggard then did deliberately set out to make what he called a folk horror film, and during production he and the team all watched Witchfinder General, which impressed them greatly. Working with director of photography Dick Bush, who shot the 1968 M.R. James adaptation Whistle and I'll Come to You, Haggard makes extensive use of the landscape, with a particular emphasis on very low-angle shots, stressing that in this story the horror is rising from the earth, something that he would go on to describe in a 2019 interview, saying, quote, "The atmosphere, the depth, the darkness, the distance, the silence, the peace, the furrow, and the camera in the furrows, signifying what's coming up from down below. The opening has the land, it has agricultural labour, young love, the beautiful valley, the earth, the fruitful earth, and who knows what the hell coming up from underneath." End quote. This imagery is underlined by the prayer repeated by Margaret during the film's most notorious scene. "Hail Behemoth, spirit of the dark, take now my blood, my flesh, my skin, and walk. Holy Behemoth, father of my life, speak now, come now, rise now from the forest, from the furrows, from the fields, and live." Filming took place on location in the Chiltern Hills in Oxfordshire, a setting that provided woodland, farmland, village houses, and, conveniently enough, an abandoned and ruined church, all within very close proximity. Tygon British were, by all accounts, less than happy with the distance of the location from the studio settings, but Haggard very much won the day, recalling in an interview for the Blu-ray release that once they found the location, he felt that everything about the project clicked into place. Here the land becomes almost an additional character, certainly far more so than in the Witchfinder General or the Wicker Man, or even in more recent films like Midsommar or the 2023 film Starvacre. We see the land as a place of work, a place of beauty, but also, crucially, as the source of evil. Much as it did in the M.R. James adaptation Whistle and I'll Come to You, Dick Bush's camera work almost creates a sense of acrophobia, with characters dwarfed by the landscape, particularly in the film's earlier sequences and long, wide-angle shots that juxtapose beauty with violence. Haggard has spoken at length about the procession scene through the fields to the ruined church, passing through branches of blossoming hawthorn trees, highlighting in interviews that while they may indeed be beautiful flowers, they hide razor-sharp thorns, a description that could very well be applied to the film itself. It may look beautiful, but there are things within that will tear at your very soul. And this now seems an opportune moment to discuss that very scene, which is the film's most controversial, centering as it does on the rape and murder of Kathy Vespers, played by Wendy Padbury. This is a very troubling and uncomfortable sequence, and to this day I am still not entirely sure how I feel about it. If its purpose, as Haggard has stated, is to show a complete breakdown of social norms and a descent into brutality, then it certainly achieves its aim. But it is a brutal and disorientating watch, and I have to say I find myself glancing away whenever I revisit the movie. What makes it even more troubling in hindsight is the knowledge that the true nature of the scene was very much sprung on Wendy Padbury. It had not been written so explicitly in the script, and most of the brutality was originally planned to take place off camera. Padbury has recalled that Haggard discussed his vision with her in the middle of a field on the day of shooting, giving her very little time to consider her decision and even less time to prepare, either mentally or physically. And with no disrespect at all to the actress, it is quite easy to imagine that the look of sheer horror on her face is very much representative of her real emotional reaction as opposed to performance, as both she and her co-star, Tamara Ustinov, have recalled her being incredibly upset at the end of filming. She has also recounted that one of the crew was so appalled that he spoke to her afterwards, offering reassurance that the scene, as filmed, would probably not get past the censors, which of course, bar a few seconds, it most certainly did. Speaking about it in an interview that is available on the 88 Films Blu-ray release, she clearly has regrets and anger about the way that the film was shot, and to be honest, one can hardly blame her. As for Haggard himself, when interviewed in the 2010 Mark Gatiss documentary, he expressed some regret about its inclusion, saying that perhaps he went too far, which, in my opinion, as you can tell, I think he probably did. Quote, "If I look at the rape scene now, I think it's probably too strong. But it's interesting that I wasn't bothered at the time. I think you will find most directors, if they get their teeth into a sequence which they think is going to be really powerful, they become completely seduced. And I was seduced by the sheer dramatic power." End quote. Probably no consolation at all, though, to Wendy Padbury. Despite all this, Padbury, who was transitioning away from her previous role as Zoe, the assistant to Patrick Troughton's Doctor Who, and moving into adulthood, gives a very good performance, as do all of the cast. In fact, in my opinion, there isn't a weak note in any of the performances, which is certainly more than can be said for many other British horror films of the time, Hammer included. Michele Dotrice, fresh off the folk horror of Hammer's 1967 film The Witches, gives a very convincing portrayal as Margaret, as does fellow Hammer graduate Barry Andrews as the ploughman Ralph Gower, whose labouring unearths the behemoth in the first place. Tamara Ustinov, the daughter of actor Peter, has an exceptionally chilling moment when her character Rosalind emerges from the attic half-crazed, and Simon Williams is also very good as Peter, Rosalind's would-be paramour, who is attacked by his own hand in the night and ends up hacking it off. There is also excellent support work from Charlotte Mitchell as the mother of the cult's first two victims, Mark and Kathy, particularly in the moment where she finds her son's body in the woodshed after being taunted by two of his killers. And this scene, again, is a direct parallel to the Mary Bell murders, echoing Bell and her accomplice taunting the parents of their first victim before his body had even been discovered. Wendy Padbury aside, there is also another Doctor Who connection in the movie, and this is in the casting of Anthony Ainley as the Reverend, who went from being tempted into sin by Angel Blake to being the fourth actor to play the Doctor's nemesis, the Master. And while we're on the subject of Doctor Who, it's probably worth mentioning that this series has also dabbled in folk horror, most notably with the John Pertwee episode titled Doctor Who and the Demons, and the Tom Baker storyline, Image of the Fendal, both of which, if we're honest, owe more than a little to the work of writer Nigel Neill. The nominal leads of Blood on Satan's Claw, if the film could be said to have any leads at all, are Patrick Wymark and Linda Hayden, playing respectively the judge and his nemesis, Angel Blake. There have been rumours that Tygon originally wanted Peter Cushing for the role of the judge, but he proved too expensive, and so Wymark was selected instead. I am certain that Cushing would have brought his usual gravitas and presence to the role, and indeed he would go on to portray a similar character in Hammer's Twins of Evil, which was also released in 1971. But it has to be said that Wymark gives an incredibly charismatic performance, playing a morally ambiguous character that may well represent the forces of good, but who isn't afraid to get his hands dirty in the process. "I have one mission here," he tells Margaret after she is captured, "to destroy your practices, and no consideration will prevent me." And in fact, in the original screenplay, the judge goes to far greater lengths to preserve quote-unquote goodness than he does in the final edit. The original script ended with the judge and his men massacring the entire village in order to preserve Christianity, but this proved to be far too downbeat for the studio, and the ending that we now recognise was filmed instead. I have to say, I think this is a real shame, as that original ending would have really pushed the movie into classic territory. But that being said, the final shot of the judge's eyes seen through a blazing fire hardly frames him as a heroic Van Helsing character. A compromise to the original vision, most certainly, but, as writer Simmons says himself, the close-up of his eye at the end rather suggests that he is now the devil himself. Despite all of the moral ambiguity, though, Wymark does bring some moments of wry humour to the part, particularly in his interactions with Squire Middleton, played by the comic actor James Hayter. The look in his eye when Middleton grovellingly tries to impress him speaks volumes, and this provides a very brief moment of lightness in amongst all of the mayhem. Not that the judge initially believes in these stories of a demon being unearthed in the fields, or indeed in the practice of witchcraft itself. Coming from London, he represents wealth and modernity, scolding the local doctor with the line, "Witchcraft is dead and long discredited. Are you bent on reviving forgotten horrors?" To which the doctor responds, "How do we know, sir, what is dead? You come from the city. You cannot know the ways of the country." A line that has become the basis for pretty much every folk horror movie ever since. Patrick Wymark had a very long stage, television and film career, which included a very memorable turn as Catherine Deneuve's repugnant landlord in 1965's Repulsion, and also a very brief cameo as Oliver Cromwell in Witchfinder General. Sadly, though, he was suffering from the effects of alcoholism at the time that Blood on Satan's Claw was made, and he would die not long after filming was completed. There have been reports of issues on set, no doubt caused by his drinking, and Simon Williams recalled him as being a fearsome man who wasn't particularly warm or friendly. Though, in balance, Linda Hayden has often spoken fondly of him in later interviews, and if nothing else, his very memorable turn in this movie acts as a fitting epitaph to a hugely talented performer. But if Blood on Satan's Claw belongs to anybody, it belongs to Linda Hayden, who, despite a comparative lack of screen time, dominates the entire movie. Born in 1953, she made her film debut at the age of 15 in the highly controversial 1969 movie Baby Love, in which she played a schoolgirl who seduces her adoptive family. I told you, it's controversial. Being completely honest, I haven't seen the movie, so I can't really comment on it objectively. But I have seen the trailer, and I think it's fair to say that if the trailer alone is anything to go by, it's certainly not a film that would be made in the current climate. Nevertheless, it earned nearly £1.5 million against a budget of $87,000, and it was the 11th highest watched movie of the year in 1969. If it didn't make her a full-blown star, then it certainly made her an up-and-coming one, and gave her the opportunity to tour the world for promotion, of which she later wrote, quote, "I was transfixed to see myself on an 80-foot high poster in Times Square, making me look like an evil creature and sending all the wrong messages. But, in an odd twist of fate, this billboard turned out to be an augur of my future within the horror genre." End quote. And it was indeed into the horror genre that she moved next, with her role as Alice in Hammer's 1970 film Taste the Blood of Dracula. This was Hammer's first attempt to update the Dracula legend, before they jumped the shark completely and woke the Count in 1970s Chelsea. And whilst it's certainly not the best of Hammer's Dracula series, it is also very far from being the worst. An essay on Victorian hypocrisy and supposed Christian values, here Hayden plays a young and innocent girl who falls under the spell of the Count, and her transformation from sweet apple-cheeked innocent to feral murderer, dispatching her father with a garden spade, is both something to behold and would certainly anticipate her performance as Angel Blake, the role that she would assume directly afterwards. I think it's fair to say that despite the impressive efforts of the rest of the cast, it is Linda Hayden's performance that really makes Blood on Satan's Claw, demonstrating an incredible screen presence and establishing her as one of the greatest villains of the folk horror movement. From attempting to seduce the priest in his own church, to accusing him of sexual assault, and then to murdering Kathy with a pair of sheep-shearing scissors, the sheer energy and commitment that she brings to the role very much carries the film, even, strangely enough, when she doesn't appear on screen. By the time that she appears in the woods, dressed in a white sheet and wearing a crown of hawthorn flowers, she has become far more menacing than the demon itself. And with her combination of beauty and evil, she is the embodiment of what film theorist Barbara Creed calls the monstrous feminine, the perfect antagonist to challenge the patriarchal system represented by the judge. As the New York Times review said when the film was released in the US, quote, "I especially like Linda Hayden as Angel Blake, the sort of girl who, fully clothed, could have easily unhinged Salem." End quote. And indeed, on its release in April 1971, the New York Times reviewed the entire film very favourably, calling it cinematic diabolism of some style and intelligence, and going on to say, quote, "It has a good deal of the quality of an H.P. Lovecraft work, in the vulnerability of even its heroic characters, as well as its pastoral landscape that contains the threat of evil within every sun-dappled glade. Most particularly, it contains Lovecraft's perfectly straight-faced acceptance of a universe whose natural order may, at any time, be overturned by supernatural disorder." End quote. Sadly, though, when it was released in the UK just a few months later, on the 16th of July, reviews were far more mixed. The Daily Mail, surprise, surprise, said it was, quote, "as silly as it is repulsive," end quote, and the Observer claimed that it neither frightened nor convinced. That being said, the Evening News suggested that it came very near to being a work of art, something with which, my earlier critiques aside, I would tend to agree. Unfortunately, though, cinema audiences didn't. People were repelled by the rape scene, and also appalled by the scene in which Margaret has a patch of skin surgically removed from her leg. This scene, incidentally, was based on Simmons' own experiences of having multiple surgeries as a child, although admittedly, these probably didn't take place on the kitchen table. Haggard later went on to suggest that audiences didn't really know what to make of it, with the juxtaposition of the beautiful and the monstrous catching them unawares, and also going on to suggest that the ambiguous framing of the judge at the end left some viewers rather dissatisfied. He went on to say, quote, "It's my instinct to make things ambiguous, which may be why the film didn't work in the marketplace." End quote. As we now know, of course, the film has gone on to be an incredibly influential piece of filmmaking, with its status growing year on year, aided by the growing obsession with folk horror that has emerged over the past decade. Without it, and its kissing cousins Witchfinder General and The Wicker Man, the landscape of horror would be a very different place indeed, and for that, if nothing else, it should be celebrated. Following the release of Blood on Satan's Claw, Linda Hayden continued to work in film and television until she entered semi-retirement in the late 1990s. Sadly, though, in my opinion, she never really got the career that she deserved, which probably says far more about the state of British filmmaking in the 1970s than it does about her talent. By this time, British horror cinema was on its last legs, and British cinema in general started to focus far more on so-called sex comedies, such as Confessions of a Window Cleaner in 1974 and Confessions from a Holiday Camp in 1977, in which Hayden co-starred with her then-partner, Robin Asquith. She made one more entry into the horror genre opposite Udo Kier in the 1976 thriller Exposé, which was also released as The House on Straw Hill and which would go on to be banned in the UK as a video nasty. She has since said that this is the only film that she has ever regretted making, as the final product, which I find to be incredibly sleazy, bore little to no relation to the film that she thought she was making. She did, however, come out of semi-retirement in 2010 for a remake of the movie titled Stalker, directed by, strangely enough, Martin Kemp from 80s new romantic band Spandau Ballet. I haven't seen it, so I cannot comment, but if anybody out there thinks it's worth a watch, please do let me know. Piers Haggard went on to have a very successful career as a director, winning a BAFTA for the groundbreaking TV series Pennies from Heaven, written by Dennis Potter. Following this, he directed the TV version of the final Quatermass story in 1979, which would also be released as a feature film a year later, in 1980. In 1981, he directed the horror movie Venom, starring Oliver Reed, Klaus Kinski, and Susan George. This was a very troubled production, which was originally due to be directed by Toby Hooper, with Haggard stepping in at the last moment when Hooper left the project. It's an incredibly silly film about a highly poisonous black mamba loose in a London townhouse, and if you ever want to see Oliver Reed with a lethal snake crawling up his trouser leg, then you need look no further. I promise I won't judge you, but I can't say the same about anybody else. In 1976, Haggard became the president of the Association of Directors and Producers, and then founded and chaired the Directors Guild of Great Britain. In 1987, he founded the Directors and Producers Rights Society, which subsequently became the organisation Directors UK, where he sat on the board. In 2016, he was awarded an OBE for services to film, television and theatre. He died on the 11th of January 2023 at the age of 83 years old. By now, you may have started to believe that I am suggesting that folk and cosmic horror are one and the same thing, and this, of course, is not the case. I tend to view the two subgenres almost as two rivers which spring from the same source, but which then split in two different directions along their journey, with additional tributaries feeding into them before they finally reach the ocean. And, as you can probably tell from that sentence, all of this talk of the countryside and rural life is finding its way into my metaphors. We've already discussed the proto-folk and cosmic horror literary sources of Algernon Blackwood and Arthur Machen, but as we move away from the fields and into the cosmos, it's certainly worth mentioning some additional literary sources that lean more towards cosmicism. Before we do that, though, it would probably be helpful to at least attempt a definition of what the term cosmic horror actually means. To help me do this, or at least define what I mean by it, I have a couple of quotations. The first is from a post that I found on Reddit, written 4 years ago by a contributor with the screen name Pristine Mycologist 15. It is, to my mind, one of the best definitions that I have come across, so with apologies to the original poster, I'm going to read it here in full. Quote, "Cosmic horror is the realization that the universe is more vast and complicated than you will ever begin to comprehend, and nothing you, or even the entirety of civilization will ever make a big enough mark to matter. You're not special, and anything that happens to you is just a random happenstance with no reason behind it, because the beings we consider gods are so beyond our understanding that they don't even acknowledge our existence. The bacteria that die coming into contact with your body have more significance to you than the entirety of human civilization does to something like Cthulhu." End quote. And the second quote is from writer Ramsey Campbell, from an interview he gave on the website newpulptales.com. Quote, "Fiction that stands in awe of the vastness and literal inhumanity of the universe, and attempts to convey a sense of the powers that might be at large out there on whatever imaginable or unimaginable business. In general, the sense of horror flows or oozes or otherwise proceeds from their encounters, disinterested or voracious or loftily engaged, but certainly mind-altering with human beings. Some of the latter may summon them, rarely to their own ultimate benefit, or ours." End quote. We see this concept in the great god Pan, where young Mary is exposed to visions of the most awful and most secret forces that lie at the heart of all things. And we also see it in dialogue provided by one of the characters in the Blackwood story, The Willows. "All my life," he says, "I have been strangely, vividly conscious of another region, not far removed from our own world in one sense, yet wholly different in kind, where great things go unceasingly, where immense and terrible personalities hurry by, intent on vast purposes, compared to which earthly affairs, the rise and fall of nations, the destinies of empires, the fate of armies and continents, are all as dust in the balance." So, whilst on the surface, for some at least, the idea of cosmic horror translates simply into the inclusion of multi-tentacled monsters, there is beneath it a philosophy concerning man's own place in the vastness of the universe. Against this, all of our hopes, dreams, and endeavours are but motes of dust in the air, or grains of sand on a giant beach, minuscule, fleeting, and lacking any real impact or significance. All rather nihilistic stuff, and that's before we even mention the writer Thomas Ligotti. Perhaps the most influential exponent of these ideas is, of course, H.P. Lovecraft, more of whom in a moment. But before him, we also have not only Machen and Blackwood, but also Robert W. Chambers and his collection of stories titled The King in Yellow. We also have William Hope Hodgson, with many of his stories, and most certainly his novel, The House on the Borderland. The King in Yellow, first published in 1895, is a collection of short stories and poems by Brooklyn-born writer Robert W. Chambers, several of which, but importantly not all, concern a forbidden play which induces madness in those who read it. This, of course, is something that we also see happen to readers of Sutter Kane in our second film of the week, In the Mouth of Madness. The eponymous King in Yellow is both the name of the play and also the title of a malevolent entity named Hastur, who rules a vast and alien city named Carcosa. Even if you've never read these stories themselves, these names might sound familiar, and that's because he lifted them, if not their significance, from the writings of fellow American author Ambrose Pierce. But more recently, they have also appeared as a homage to Chambers in the writings of H.P. Lovecraft and Stephen King, to name just a few. More recently still, they were also used by the writer Nick Pizzolatto for the first season of True Detective, along with a recurrent spiral symbol which homages the yellow sign from the Chambers stories. Meanwhile, The House on the Borderland is a novel written by William Hope Hodgson, who we mentioned briefly back in episode 14 when we discussed coastal and seafaring horrors. And indeed, this novel begins on the coast, with two men on a fishing holiday discovering an old journal, the content of which forms the main body of the story. Within its pages are the experiences of a reclusive old man who lived in an ancient and strangely constructed house, long thought to be evil. Within its walls, he experiences visions of strange unearthly dimensions, distortions in time and space, and also suffers visitations from monstrous pig-faced creatures which emerged from a seemingly bottomless pit located nearby. A radical departure from the usual literary Gothic fiction of the 19th century, it was highly influential on those who read it, and has been described by a more recent reviewer as, quote, an imaginative tour de force whose power transcends its patchwork construction. The cosmic vision sequences make it equally interesting as a scientific romance, but it definitely strikes what its admirer H.P. Lovecraft sought to define as the true note of cosmic horror, end quote. Lovecraft, whose name is now synonymous with cosmic horror, so much so that it is also referred to as Lovecraftian horror, was certainly impressed by all of the authors mentioned so far, and one can certainly see elements of their work in his own stories. It is with Lovecraft that the ideas planted by the earlier authors really took root, though admittedly it would not really be until his work was reprinted in the 1950s and 1960s that it truly found a wider audience, penetrating the public consciousness and leading to the horror subgenre that we recognise today. His stories, The Call of Cthulhu, At the Mountains of Madness, The Dunwich Horror, and The Shadow over Innsmouth, are now seen as foundational texts, though, as I hope I have demonstrated, he built those foundations on ground that had already been prepared by others. Named at birth Howard Phillips Lovecraft in Providence, Rhode Island in 1890, he came from a wealthy family, but suffered a personal tragedy at the age of 3 when his father was institutionalized in an insane asylum following a psychotic break, possibly brought about by long-term syphilis. This commitment to an asylum would also doubtless inform the fate of many of the characters in Lovecraft's stories, who often end up interred in similar institutions following their encounters with nameless horrors from beyond. Although the family maintained their status for a while, their finances took a turn following the death of his grandfather, and they moved out of their family mansion and into far more modest lodgings. A sickly child, both physically and emotionally, he read voraciously, and fascinated by astronomy, would frequently visit the observatory at nearby Brown University, spending hours staring into the night skies through their telescope, an activity that would greatly influence his subsequent writing. He lived with his mother until she too was institutionalized in 1919, by which time he had already become a published writer, with essays printed by the United Amateur Press Association and later in various pulp magazines. Following his 1924 marriage to fellow writer and Amateur Press Association publisher Sonia Green, he moved to New York and joined a writer's circle which would introduce him to the now legendary publication Weird Tales, which would become his most prominent publisher. However, New York was not a good environment for his mental health, and he returned to Providence in 1926. This move caused a rift in his marriage to Sonia, which was compounded by financial challenges that necessitated them living in separate cities. Along with general incompatibility, their marriage fell apart, and he filed for divorce in 1929. But although Lovecraft was the one who filed for divorce, he never signed the divorce papers, so the two remained legally married, albeit without Sonia's knowledge, until his death in 1937. But there is far more to the story than this, and it would be completely inappropriate to discuss Lovecraft and omit a very troubling element. This was that, in the first half of his adult life at least, he expressed views that were racist and promoted white supremacy, although he appeared to distance himself from these in the 1930s. This is something that is understandably challenging for many fans of his writing, and the controversy around this continues to this day, raising the question of whether one can truly separate the art from the artist. This is a very thorny question, and one on which, in this instance at least, I am not sure that my opinion carries much weight or is even appropriate. Firstly, because personally, a few key stories aside, I have never been the biggest fan of his actual writing. Sorry, Lovecraft fans. And secondly, because whilst I find his earlier views abhorrent, as a white, middle-class, middle-aged man living in the UK, I am concerned about how much agency I have to critique this responsibly. What I can do, however, is recommend an excellent documentary on this very issue, which is called Exegesis Lovecraft and which was released in 2022. This was created by a Pakistani-Canadian filmmaker called Qais Pasha and details his early love of the writer, his emotional reaction and disappointment on discovering this element of Lovecraft's life, and his thoughts on whether he can reconcile his love of the stories with the writer's earlier beliefs. He is joined on this journey by many people of colour who also discuss their feelings around the issue, and ultimately it is their voices, and not mine, that need to be heard on the subject. You can find it free of charge, in the UK at least, on TUBI, and it is a thought-provoking and highly recommended watch. What I can say about Lovecraft is that his mythos and his writing have, without doubt, been highly influential, and the reins of cosmic horror have since been picked up by a plethora of writers and filmmakers, though, as in all things, some of these are far more successful than others. In my opinion, some of the best writers include Brian Lumley, Ramsey Campbell, Adam Neville, Led Barron, John Paul Fitch, and my particular favourite, Thomas Ligotti, whose work is truly bleak and nightmarish, and also, in my opinion, served, uncredited, as the inspiration for much of the dialogue in True Detective Season 1. His stories, The Red Tower and The Town Manager, are particular favourites, combining existential dread with a Kafkaesque perspective of the world. And if you liked Matthew McConaughey's dialogue in True Detective Season 1, I think you will enjoy Thomas Ligotti very much. All of which brings us on to our second film of the week, which is In the Mouth of Madness from 1994. This was written by Michael DeLuca and directed by John Carpenter, and stars Sam Neill, Julie Carmen, Jürgen Prochnow, David Warner, and Charlton Heston. And now we are getting back into spoilers, so again, if you've not seen this movie, it's time to hit pause and come back once you have. And fair warning, this time these spoilers are going to be pretty major, including a substantial twist in the narrative. So, if you don't want this completely ruined for you, it's best to watch the movie first. In the Mouth of Madness began life as a screenplay by Michael DeLuca, who is, at the time of recording at least, the joint CEO of Warner Brothers, at least until they get taken over by Netflix, leading to the death of cinema as we know it. He is also the former chairman of Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, the former head of production at DreamWorks, and also the former president of New Line Cinema. But before all of this, he started his career back in 1988 as a writer on the TV spin-off series Freddy's Nightmares. This led to his first feature film credit as an associate producer on, oh dear, Leatherface, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre 3, before serving as a writer-producer on Freddy's Dead, The Final Nightmare. Don't worry, things do get better soon, I promise. Around this time, he wrote the screenplay for In the Mouth of Madness, a project that was initially offered to John Carpenter to direct. However, at this stage, Carpenter passed on the project, feeling that the script needed too much work and also, by all accounts, due to concerns about depicting the unknowable nature of cosmic horror. According to his wife and producer, Sandy King, quote, It's one thing for H.P. Lovecraft to write it on a page and let your imagination go there. It's another thing when you have it on the movie screen." End quote. Following this, Tony Randell, the director of Hellbound, Hellraiser 2, was attached, as was Mary Lambert, the director of the 1989 version of Pet Sematary and 1992's follow-up, Pet Sematary 2. However, as we now know, neither of these progressed past the early development stages. The screenplay eventually circled back to John Carpenter, who signed on to the project in 1992, becoming the third of a back-to-back set of projects following the anthology movie Body Bags, which was released in 1993, and his remake of Village of the Damned, which was released in 1995. According to Sandy King, quote, "The script needed a lot of work, so John worked on it with DeLuca. I think that's what finally made it into something that interested him, and brought it into the realm of the Old Ones and Cthulhu and that kind of thing. It was a matter of trying to get the Lovecraftian side of it working without it winding up in oblivion. It's really hard to get a Lovecraftian feel without relying on the unspeakable and unknowable horror. Where do you go from there?" End quote. From John Carpenter's own perspective, and according to an interview he gave in 2013, quote, "I was drawn to the fact that it was really Lovecraft. I thought that's great, because there really hasn't been a good Lovecraft movie. Mike DeLuca wrote the screenplay, and there's lots of love in it for Lovecraft and for old horror and science fiction movies. So I'm very happy that we did it." End quote. The story of In the Mouth of Madness centres on John Trent, played by Sam Neill, an insurance fraud investigator who is hired by the appropriately titled Arcane Publishing to find their missing and best-selling author, Sutter Kane, a writer with an avid fan base that borders on the obsessive. Kane is a writer of weird fiction, and whilst his success and status in the culture of the movie is clearly based on Stephen King, the titles and themes of his work are also clearly derived from H.P. Lovecraft. These include The Thing in the Basement, which is a reference to the Lovecraft story The Thing on the Doorstep, The Whisperer of the Dark, which is derived from Lovecraft's novella The Whisperer in Darkness, and The Haunter Out of Time, which is a hybrid of the actual titles The Haunter of the Dark and The Shadow Out of Time. Even the title of the movie itself, which is also the name of Kane's final novel, is a reference to At the Mountains of Madness, one of Lovecraft's seminal works. There is also the Hobbs End Horror, which not only references Lovecraft's story The Dunwich Horror, but is also a homage to Hobbs End, the fictional tube station and region of London that is featured in the Nigel Kneale TV series and Hammer movie, Quatermass and the Pit, a film that we'll be discussing in just a few weeks' time. But it's not just the titles of the books featured in the film that reference Lovecraft's writing. Lines of dialogue are also taken directly from the author's work. When Styles reads aloud from Kane's final manuscript, the phrase illimitable gulf of the unknown is taken directly from the 1924 story The Rats in the Walls, a tale that we discussed back in episode 10 when we covered the horrors of cannibalism. At the publishing house, Trent is assigned a partner, Linda Styles, played by Julie Carmen, Kane's editor and clearly an ardent admirer of his fiction, as well as the profits that his work generates. "Maybe he's too sophisticated for you," she tells Trent. Sutter Kane happens to be this century's most widely read author. You can forget Stephen King. Kane outsells them all. Trent also begins to research his subject by reading some of his novels, which appear to have an effect on both his dreams and also, as the film progresses, his waking life. And these effects are not just limited to John Trent, as Styles herself explains in the movie, saying that Kane's writing has been known to have an effect on his less stable readers, causing disorientation, memory loss, and severe paranoid reaction. Trent himself is incredibly cynical about the enterprise, suspecting it to be a marketing ploy, a conviction that he maintains even as the world falls apart around him. Nor is he particularly impressed by Kane's writing, describing his work as horror crap and saying, quote, "Well, pulp novels, they're all pretty familiar. They all seem to have the same plot. Slimy things in the dark, people go mad, they turn into monsters." End quote. This seems to make Trent not only a critic of Kane's writing, but also the horror genre in general, and one can only imagine that this is perhaps a deliberate nod to the criticisms directed at Carpenter's own work over the years. Even Trent, though, has to concede that, quote, "They're kind of better written than you expect. They sort of get to you in a way. I don't know if it's a style of writing, or his use of description, or whatever. But..." End quote. And get to you in a way these stories certainly do. When Trent visits a ransacked bookstore to buy copies of Kane's work, we hear a voiceover of a news report advising of rioting and barely coherent witnesses, all reporting having read Sutter Kane's latest novel. The news report finishes by asking, "What is this horrible, unexplainable madness that is gripping our lives? What in the world is happening?" During the investigation, it transpires that Kane's disappearance was indeed initially part of an elaborate publicity campaign, but that things have now spun out of control. This becomes particularly evident when Trent and Styles arrive at the small New England town of Hobbs End, a supposedly fictional place which is populated by characters from Kane's novels as well as their locations, including a truly remarkable Byzantine black church. As the film progresses, it becomes clear that Kane's writing has gone beyond influencing the mental state of his readers and is now changing the nature of reality itself, opening the way for a raft of interdimensional ancient gods to return to the world and reclaim it as their own. As he tells Styles in the interior of the Byzantine church, all those horrible slimy things trying to get back in, they're all true. More than that, Trent discovers that he is, in fact, a fictional character himself, the protagonist of Kane's final novel, In the Mouth of Madness, with no control or autonomy whatsoever. "I think, therefore you are," Kane tells him, in response to Trent's protests, that he is not a piece of fiction. By now then, the film has moved into the world of metafiction, exploring the concept of the writer as Godhead, something that causes Trent to exclaim that God isn't supposed to be a hack writer, though I would politely suggest that perhaps that is indeed exactly what he is. This is something that has also been explored by Stephen King in his Dark Tower series, a collection of books that incorporate multiple genres and also include an appearance by King himself, as characters realize that they are fictional beings, and the book begins to break the fourth wall and comment on its own construction. This concept can be traced back to the term parabasis from ancient Greek theatre, in which the chorus addressed the audience directly, breaking the fourth wall and suspension of disbelief to reveal that they are just performers in a play. Moving forward many centuries in time, we also see it in two 20th century Spanish novels. The first of these is Mist by Miguel de Unamuno, published in 1914, in which, during the course of the narrative, the protagonist consults the author himself and discovers that he is just a character in a book. It also occurs in part 2 of the Cervantes novel Don Quixote, in which the characters in the book have already read part 1. But perhaps the most famous examples still come from the world of theatre, with the Italian playwright Pirandello's 1921 play Six Characters in Search of an Author, in which characters appear and insist that they are unfinished fictional beings, demanding that an author completes them. This conceit was used again by Tom Stoppard in his 1966 play Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead, which applies Pirandello's approach to the play Hamlet and features two incidental characters from Shakespeare's work, realizing that they are indeed just characters in a play. Pirandello's work also inspired an episode of The Twilight Zone titled 5 Characters in Search of an Exit, in which, huge spoiler alert, a group of seemingly disparate characters, an army major, ballerina, clown, hobo, and bagpiper, realize that they are just toys in a charity collection barrel. And it's not too big a leap from that to the Toy Story movies, quite honestly, although I suppose that may be taking the game of 6 degrees of separation just a little bit too far. The question as to the nature of reality is one that is raised throughout the movie, touching on some of the more nihilistic tropes of both cosmic horror and philosophy. This is summed up in an exchange between Trent and Styles, in which she explains her fascination with Sutter Kane's writing. Responding to Trent's assertion that Kane's work isn't scary because it's not real or anything, Styles responds that Kane's writing only isn't real from Trent's point of view, going on to say, quote, "Right now, reality shares your point of view. What scares me about Kane's work is what might happen if reality shared his point of view." End quote. She goes on to say that reality is just what we tell each other it is. At any moment, sane and insane could easily switch places, and if the insane were to become the majority, you would find yourself locked in a padded cell, wondering what happened to the world, ending with the point that it would be pretty lonely, being the last one left. Little wonder, then, that the film is now seen by audiences and by Carpenter himself as the third part of an unofficial apocalypse trilogy, a term retrospectively applied to 1982's The Thing and Prince of Darkness from 1987. In each of these films, the world is under threat by otherworldly infection. The first through alien invasion and impersonation, the second through possession by the very essence of evil, and the third, perhaps most intriguingly, through language itself. Kane's novel and its film adaptation, which, as it turns out, is the very film we are watching, acts as the gateway, infecting its readers and viewers with, at first, insanity and also a rather messy eye condition. This notion is reminiscent of the Chambers stories about the King in Yellow, and here the reading of the book begins the change that will bring the old ones back to conquer the world. Towards the end of the film, Kane tells Trent that when people begin to lose their ability to distinguish fantasy from reality, the old worlds begin to come back, going on to say that the more that people believe, the faster the journey becomes. Much as in Blood on Satan's Claw, the infection starts with the children, first seen chasing a dog through the deserted streets of Hobbs End, before beginning to mutate into something far more monstrous. Once the script was written, the casting process began, and the role of John Trent was given to Sam Neill, with whom Carpenter had already worked on the 1992 movie Memoirs of an Invisible Man. Neill was, by all accounts, the director's only choice for the role. Born in Northern Ireland in 1947 to an English mother and a New Zealand father, Neill and his family moved to Christchurch, New Zealand in 1954. His first film appearance was in the 1977 action thriller titled Sleeping Dogs, but since this time he has appeared in a surprising number of influential horror films, most notably as the adult Damien, the Antichrist, in Omen 3, The Final Conflict, in 1981, and Andrzej Żuławski's mind-blowing film Possession. In this, both he and Isabella Gianni give soul-blistering performances of such intensity that one can hardly take one's eyes off the screen for even a second, and we'll be covering this in a few weeks' time, so I'll save any further comments until then. Other films of note are A Cry in the Dark opposite Meryl Streep, which is an account of the notorious death of infant Azaria Chamberlain and her parents' fight to prove that she was killed by a dingo as opposed to at their own hands. He also appeared in the 1988 ocean-based thriller Dead Calm with Nicole Kidman and Billy Zane, Jane Campion's The Piano in 1993, opposite Holly Hunter, Harvey Keitel, and Anna Paquin, and of course Jurassic Park for Steven Spielberg, which was released in 1993 and which opened just as Neill arrived in Toronto to begin working on In the Mouth of Madness. The success of the Spielberg film and his sudden, widespread international celebrity was by all accounts something of a surprise to him, as Sandy King later recalled in an interview, saying, quote, "What was funny was Jurassic Park came out the week that Sam Neill arrived in Toronto, and he had no idea at all it was this phenomena. I had security ready to pick him up and have him processed out. So security had to come out, and we had a car waiting for him outside. Never entering the terminal, he had no idea that Jurassic Park had just taken the box office by storm and that he was now a big deal. And he couldn't figure out why I was out there and why he was being ushered through all the security. He's that kind of guy. We just settled in for work." End quote. His performance in the movie leans heavily into the fact that Trent is a fictional character, something that becomes more apparent on second viewing. His reactions to the insanity around him are remarkably straight-faced and laced with humour, reacting not as a real person would to the carnage, but instead as he is written in Kane's novel. This ends when he finally becomes completely unglued on the bus journey that is supposedly taking him back to civilization, destined to deliver the book to the publisher, whether he can remember doing it or not. As the film is told through flashback, we first meet Trent in his supposedly insane persona, although he is wise enough to exaggerate his condition to try to ensure his place in the asylum. He draws crosses on the walls and himself to convince his doctor, David Warner, that he belongs within the relatively safe haven of his padded cell and not in the outside world, saying, "Things are turning to shit out there, aren't they?" David Warner, of course, has been in a room filled with crosses before, in the original The Omen, and it's easy to believe that this plot device is also a reference to that earlier film, which also posits the idea of an apocalypse, albeit a Judeo-Christian one, as opposed to Lovecraftian. And much like the Byzantine church, which was found quite by accident on the way to scout another location, the exteriors of the asylum and the huge hallway within were a real location too, an Art Deco water treatment plant located just outside of Toronto. This location, as well as the rest of the movie, is impressively captured by the camera of director of photography Gary B. Kibb, who had also worked with Carpenter on multiple movies, including Prince of Darkness, 1988's They Live, Body Bags, and Village of the Damned. Joining Neill is Julie Carmen as Styles. She had made her first screen appearance in 1980 in Gloria, directed by John Cassavetes, and also in the same year, Night of the Juggler, opposite James Brolin. In 1988, she starred in the Robert Redford-directed The Milagro Beanfield War, and in the same year made her horror debut in Fright Night Part 2, for which she was nominated for a Saturn Award for Best Actress. A trained psychotherapist, she is also a choreographer and yoga instructor, though it's worth noting that the backbending sequence that occurs after Styles is infected was performed not by her, but instead by a contortionist stunt double. Interviewed for the website Inverse.com in 2025, Carmen had very positive memories of the filmmaking experience, and in particular, the 2-week rehearsal period prior to filming, saying, quote, "We had 2 weeks to rehearse, and Sam Neill hadn't arrived yet from New Zealand, So it was just Jürgen Prochnow and John and me. We got to watch the movie His Girl Friday, because John had in his template that Rosalind Russell kind of enters the office in the same way that I walk through the office and go down the stairs with that very long monologue about Sutter Kane. But basically, John got to share with us some of his theories about the world. We shot this just before the end of the millennium, so the 1990s were just ending, and he had this very astute theory that, at the end of a millennium, people get a little bit nuts. John felt that in the beginning of a new millennium and a new century, they're sometimes very authoritarian and fundamentalist and concrete narrow thinking that tries to establish really hard and fast rules. He felt a lot of that was happening, and I think the movie was informed by his thoughts." End quote. These thoughts appear to be summed up in a line delivered by Trent early in the movie when he says to Styles, quote, "Lady, nothing surprises me. We fucked up the air, the water, we fucked up each other. Why don't we finish the job and just flush our brains down the toilet?" End quote. Carmen's performance in the movie came under, in my opinion, very unfair criticism, with critics suggesting that she was the weak link in the film and that Styles was colourless and that Carmen lacked chemistry with Sam Neill. However, the character's stiffness was a deliberate choice, designed to not only echo the style of 1940s performances, but also the fact that she too, like Trent, is a fictional character. She is deliberately playing a stereotype of a hard-nosed businesswoman in the first half of the movie, though it is clear that viewers didn't pick up on this at the time. To be fair to them, I think it becomes much clearer on a second viewing once the secrets of the film have been revealed, and it has to be said that her choice to play a deliberately stiff and uptight character is a brave one. Certainly, post-possession, her character becomes far more alive, and her frenzied screaming of "I'm losing me" as she writhes on the bed, trying to hold on to her sanity, stuck with me for a very long time, and is still an incredibly impactful moment. Joining she and Neill is Wilhelm von Homburg playing one of the townspeople, and he is perhaps best remembered as the antagonist in Ghostbusters 2. There's also David Warner as the doctor in the clinic, Charlton Heston as the head of Arcane Publishing, and most importantly of all, Jürgen Prochnow as the author behind all of the insanity. Prochnow, born in Germany in 1941, made his screen debut in 1972 in a German movie called Zoff, but he rose to international fame in the 1981 Wolfgang Petersen-directed Das Boot, which follows a German U-boat during World War II. This is now widely regarded as one of the greatest German films of all time, and really brought the actor to an international audience. Shortly after this, he starred in the Michael Mann horror movie The Keep, about a group of Nazi soldiers who unleash a supernatural force, a film which has gone on to build an incredibly loyal cult following. A year later, in 1984, he starred as Duke Leto Atreides in David Lynch's adaptation of Dune, and he then continued his Hollywood career in multiple movies, including as the main villain in Beverly Hills Cop 2 in 1987, as the menacing lodger in the Demi Moore apocalyptic horror The Seventh Sign in 1988, and as the woodsman in Twin Peaks Fire Walk with Me, again directed by David Lynch. He brings a glacial menace and a barely concealed insanity to the role of Sutter Kane, a character who in many ways mirrors that of Colonel Kurtz in Apocalypse Now, only thankfully without Marlon Brando's incoherent dialogue and penchant for overacting. Prochnow's first appearance, standing at the doors of the Black Church, is a spectacular reveal, and his calm and measured delivery of his dialogue as he reveals Kane's master plan is a wise choice, suggesting a character who is not so much a madman as he is the god of his own creation, which, of course, in this case, he very much is. On its release in 1994, In the Mouth of Madness received, at best, lukewarm reviews, with critics calling it underwhelming and confusing and pretentious. Horror at this stage in the 1990s was really not in good shape, and audiences and critics were clearly not ready for a film which challenged these standard formats. Carpenter himself explained his intent in an interview in the run-up to the film's release, saying in Fangoria, quote, "It's a really bad time for horror. A lot of techniques have been stolen by mainstream action pictures. What horror has to do, as far as I'm concerned, is turn a new corner and come up with something fresh. I think we're all waiting for a redefining of the horror film. We need a 2001. We need to do for horror what 2001 did for science fiction." End quote. But sadly, as far as viewers of the time were concerned, this was not it. We were still a few years off from the meta-horrors of Scream and the lo-fi terrors of the Blair Witch Project, and so perhaps the movie was a step too far for the average filmgoer of the period. As Julie Carmen put it in an interview with Inverse.com, the script, quite honestly, went over people's heads. By the time of the film's release, Michael DeLuca had graduated from scriptwriting and had become the head of production at New Line Cinema, overseeing a series of films that would come to define both the studio and the decade. These included Boogie Nights, Austin Powers, Rush Hour, Blade, American History X, Magnolia, and one of the films that we're talking about next week. But more of that at the end of the show. Julie Carmen continued her multifaceted career in both film and television, as well as psychotherapy, yoga, and choreography. She sat on the board of directors of Women in Film for 3 years, and also for 6 years served on the board of directors of IFP West, during which time she created the John Cassavetes Award for Emerging Filmmakers. Jürgen Prochnow starred in films as varied as The English Patient in 1996, Air Force One in 1997, The Da Vinci Code in 2006, and Merlin and the War of the Dragons in 2008. He has also had an extensive television career in his homeland of Germany, as well as narrating German audiobooks, including the audiobook for Frank Herbert's Dune. Sam Neill continued his journey into horror with Event Horizon in 1997, directed by Paul Anderson and co-starring Lawrence Fishburne and Jolie Richardson. He returned to the role of Dr. Alan Grant in Jurassic Park 3 in 2001, and since then he has worked consistently across an incredibly wide range of film and television roles, including as the main antagonist in Series 1 of Peaky Blinders, as General John MacArthur in the exceptional TV adaptation of Agatha Christie's And Then There Were None in 2015, and then reprised his role as Alan Grant in Jurassic World Dominion in 2022. His most recent on-screen appearance has been in the TV miniseries The 12, and we are due to see him next year in Godzilla vs. Kong Supernova, which is currently in post-production. And, as mentioned earlier, we'll be discussing him again in just a few weeks' time when we revisit one of his earlier roles in 1981's Possession. Blood on Satan's Claw and In the Mouth of Madness are both examples of two very different genres which spring from the same literary sources. Both share the idea that what we consider normality and reality can be overturned at the drop of a hat, and both deal with the notion of elder gods, or possibly demons, returning to claim what historically was once theirs. In both films, mankind and its hopes, dreams, foibles and faults fade into nothingness in comparison with what has gone before, with darkness spreading initially through the children until it extends its reach, or should that be tentacles, into wider society as a whole. I'm going to wrap up this section by reading a quote from my favourite cosmic horror author Thomas Ligotti, who I mentioned earlier, with a message that sums up not only the ethos behind both of these films, but also the nihilistic nature of cosmic horror itself. Quote, "Madness, mayhem, erotic vandalism, devastation of innumerable souls. While we scream and perish, history licks its fingers and turns the page." End quote. All of which brings me to the end of what has turned out to be a bumper episode to see in 2026. So for everybody that's still listening at this stage, thank you very much for sticking with me, and I hope that you've enjoyed it. And if you're enjoying the series, please do remember to rate, review, and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you feel so inclined, please do consider sharing this with anybody that you think might be interested. Next week, we are continuing our rather nihilistic themes with a double bill concerning serial killers, urban paranoia, and social isolation. So, Happy New Year, everybody! First up, we are exploring a film that I guess can't really be categorised as horror, but let's face it, it hasn't stopped me so far. We open then with Seven from David Fincher, released in 1995 and starring Brad Pitt, Morgan Freeman and Gwyneth Paltrow. Then we follow this with our first Japanese movie of the series, and this is Cure from 1997 by one of my favourite directors, Kiyoshi Kurosawa. This stars Koji Yakusho, Anna Nakagawa and Masato Hagiwara. And if you've never seen that film before, you are in for a real treat, and I have to say, I'm rather envious of you. So if you want to watch along, Seven is currently available, in the UK at least, to rent or buy on Amazon Video, Apple TV or the Sky Store, and it's also available for streaming on, God help us, Netflix. Cure, on the other hand, is available on the Criterion Channel in the US, the BFI player in the UK, and also Amazon UK Prime Video. So, with all of that being said, I'll be back next Sunday for the discussion, and until then, thank you once again very much for listening, and have a really great week. Goodbye.